Welcome to episode number 25, and in this week's episode, we delve into the nostalgic memories of Oliver Fallon as he takes us back to the vibrant streets of Boyle during the 1970 World Cup. Oliver reminisces about his time attending different schools in Boyle, the excitement of collecting World Cup cards, and the impact the tournament had on the community. We also explore the changes in Boyle's landscape, the rise of Patsy Quinn's factory, and the transformation of Irish football over the years. Get ready to immerse yourself in the colourful streets of Boyle as we journey through Oliver's cherished memories. So sit back, relax, and let Oliver transport you to a time of unity, passion, and sport and magic. So let's dive in. Welcome, Oliver, to the Voices of Boyle. Hope you're keeping well.
I'm fine. Thanks, Carlo.
So, Oliver, to kick things off, let's go straight into when you moved to Boyle. You told me in 1966 in Upper Marian Road. So, can you tell us a bit about that and maybe where you originally came from before that?
Yeah, well, I had a bit of an unorthodox upbringing prior to moving to Boyle in 1966. Neither of my parents were from Boyle. My father is from County Galway, and my mother, her father had been a Garda sergeant, so she had grown up in different places, mainly in the west of Ireland. But she'd spent some of her childhood in Croghan, which is just outside Boyle, where her father was stationed, I think, in the 1930s or during the war. So there was some connection with Boyle, quite a tenuous one. But I was actually born in Dublin. But when I was 6 months old, my father got a job in West Africa in a country called Ghana as a teacher. So when I was 6 months old, I went out there along with him and my mother, and we lived in Ghana for 3 years. And then he got another teaching job in Nigeria, and we were there for another 2 years. So my early years were quite international. I went to international schools. I mixed with both children that were indigenous to the countries I was from and also the children of other, we'll say, foreign workers in the country, Dutch, Canadians, etc., etc. Anyway, my parents moved back to Ireland in 66 and they moved to Boyle around April. My father moved here first to Boyle because he got a teaching job in a school halfway between Boyle and Ballymote called Carrickrory. So he got a job there as the headmaster, and he moved to Boyle, I think, around January or February of 66. We joined him a couple of months later, around April, May of 66. I'm pretty sure maybe early May of 66. And we moved into a house at number 28 Upper Marian Road. Now, what you've got to remember is Ireland in the 1960s was changing at a very rapid pace, and Sean Lemass had become the Taoiseach. He took over from De Valera in 1959, and he was a much more forward-thinking man. And the first thing he did was set up a programme of economic expansion for Ireland. Like, if people remember back, which probably people don't, but if people could recall back, in the 1950s, after the Second World War, tens of thousands of people had to leave Ireland, mainly to go to England or the UK and some to America. And that was because there was no jobs in Ireland, and these other countries were rebuilding after the war. So there was a huge population hemorrhage from Ireland in the 1950s. And I certainly always remember my mother talking about all these neighbours and friends she'd grown up, and most of them were either in England or in America. So by 1966, by the time we had moved to Boyle, this programme of economic expansion was beginning to have an effect in that people, there was jobs, they were limited, but they were available. And people, immigration declined. And not only did immigration decline, But some people that had lived abroad began to move back to Ireland because opportunities, of course, were arising. And my parents were probably part of that, because I think their initial idea when they came back from West Africa was to move to England. But I think that, as opportunities had opened up, and as I say, my father got a teaching job, we ended up moving to Boyle, number 28 Marion Road. And I remember it very well. It was a big change for me. I had a lot of things to get used to. A monocultural society for one. And also the other thing that I found the food, I can always remember this very well. I found the food in Ireland very boring, very tasteless. Because obviously when we lived in Africa, although my mother didn't really cook that much, she did try, but we had cooks where we lived and in the houses that we lived in, and they used to cook a lot of spicy curries and spicy food and rice and things like that. That diet was taken off me when I came to Boyle. But anyway, never mind. And I kind of remember, like, from 1966 up until the early 70s as a kind of a very happy time. I don't have very many bad memories of it. I recall all the neighbours and the other families in our street. Upper Marian Road, where we live, probably had been built, it hadn't been long built, probably been built in the late 50s, early 60s. It was a cul-de-sac then. You went up Marion Road, and when you got up as far as the railway gate, you could go no further. The two estates that are now at the back of Upper Marion Road, which are Hanley Avenue and Churchview, they were just open fields when we moved there. And across the road from where we lived, there was a very small building, which was what was later to become St. Mary's College, which is now Abbey College, I think.
Abbey Community College.
Abbey Community College. But back then it was just one building, very small, and there was a reason for that. And I remember all the families in our street, our next door neighbours. On one side were Martin and Marie Higgins. Martin was an ambulance driver, and on the other side was Liam Cahill and his wife Etna, and Liam was a commercial traveller, I think. On the other side of the Cahills was a family called the Mulrenans, and Pat and Peggy, I think they had a large family. And then on the other side of the Higginses, there was a couple called Desi Healy and Peggy Healy. Desi worked for Post and Telegraphs. And then as you went further up and down the streets, there was Mrs. McLaughlin, then there was the Roddy family, then there was the Scotts, and then there was Patsy Quinn, lived further down. They're the people that I can remember, the families that I can remember off the top of my head. If I really put my mind to it, I could probably remember every family in the Upper Marion Road area. But at the time, they were the ones that were the closest to us. Now, there was children, and quite a lot of children in a lot of those houses, and we all played on the street. Because Upper Marion Road was more or less a cul-de-sac, and there was, what you've got to remember was there's very few cars around at the time. You know, the street was our playground, and we were always out in the street, especially in the summer evenings, running around. And very few, what you've also got to remember at that time was very few houses had televisions. I think when I first moved to Marion Road, I can only remember 2 houses with televisions. That's just 2 houses. And I mean, it was very difficult to knock on somebody's door and say, can I come in and watch television? But 2 houses. Now that changed rapidly. The other thing, as I said, was there was very few cars. I remember my father had a car. He needed a car because he had to drive all the way out to where he worked, which was a good distance. I remember Martin Higgins, my next door neighbour, he was an ambulance driver. He didn't have a private car at the time, but, you know, he drove the ambulance home, parked it outside his house. Why wouldn't he? Desi Healy, who lived further up, he worked for, as I say, Post and Telegraphs, and he drove the Post and Telegraphs van. So, Liam Cahill, who lived the other side, he did have a private car, being a commercial traveller. But as I say, they're the only two private cars I can remember at the time. Now, I could be wrong, but they were the only, when we first moved there. I remember my father had one and Liam Cahill, the next door neighbour, had one, and they used to be parked outside the house. So, very few cars, very few televisions. As you see, times have changed very, very quickly. Now, also what I recall at that time, all the men were in work. I just listed, like my father was a teacher, Martin next door was an ambulance driver. But all the women, my mother included, no matter how well qualified they were or what jobs they had, they were all obliged to give up the work once they married. This was a law that had been brought in about 1932. There was a number of reasons for it. Economic. They didn't want women competing with men for a very limited job pool. And also, Ireland, they wanted the woman in the home. It was predominantly a Catholic country, certainly Southern Ireland was, and, the woman's place was in the home. Now, this is something that I feel has never been properly addressed, in that I can only talk about my own mother, but my own mother was a very qualified woman. She was a very intelligent woman. She was a very bright woman. And she had trained as a TB nurse, and she had also trained as an orthopaedic nurse. And when she married my father in 1959, she had to give up her job. And she never really worked full-time ever again. So when you think of those housewives sat at home, their children went off to school in the morning, their husbands went off out to work, and they were just left at home to their own devices. And I'm sure it can't have been good, and it certainly wasn't good for my mother mentally, to be just sat there, left at home. Your only job was to have the dinner ready for your husband when he came home, and your children. So that was kind of one of the darker memories I have of that time. And that ban wasn't lifted until 1973 in public sector jobs, when Ireland joined what was then known as the Common Market. So anyway, moving on to things a little bit brighter. The school across the road was interesting. Very small school. It had been opened by Canon Dodd, and it provided a secondary school education just for boys. But then that changed. In September 1967, there was a milestone in Irish society in that free secondary school education was brought in. So from September 1967 onwards, everybody, boys and girls, was entitled to a free secondary school education. So that prompted a massive build across the road from our house, which probably wouldn't be allowed nowadays, but, new buildings were swiftly put up. Some of them were prefabs. One was a big, huge science hall that cast a shadow over all the front of our houses. And then all the buses began to arrive, bringing all the young lads from the countryside in to complete their free secondary school education. So that was another thing I can remember. And I recall it very well. A very small building suddenly becomes a huge, big complex. Well, huge to me at the time, being the age I was. The other thing I can remember was Boyle is a former garrison town. So GAA, well, hurling certainly wasn't played. I never saw that played. But GAA wasn't played in the town. It was played out in the countryside, but not in the town. So soccer was the king sport in Boyle at the time. And I remember all these soccer games used to take place down on the pleasure ground, and we all used to go down to the end of Marion Road, sit in the wall, and watch the soccer games in the pleasure ground. And I always remember Paddy Hatter, the late Paddy Hatter. He had a house directly opposite the pleasure ground, and he used to be the referee, and he had all the advice about never back pass, and face him down. He'll have to give away a penalty. It was quite exciting, and of course the big soccer star at the time was Georgie Best. And we all wanted to be Georgie Best. You know, if you were ever playing a game of soccer on the street, you wanted to be Georgie Best. You know, he was king at the time. And anyway, then gradually, in quite a short time, more cars began to be bought privately. So more cars began to appear in the street. Just one other little recollection that I have. My mother could drive. She had learned how to drive out in Africa, and I could be mistaken here, and I beg to be corrected if I am, but my mother was the only woman that I can remember on Marion Road that could drive.
In Marion Road?
Yeah.
Or Boyle? Marion Road.
I'm sure there was other women in Boyle that could drive, but she was the only one I could remember in Marion Road.
Marion
that could
Road,
drive.
right.
Yeah. You know, because at that time,
cars were limited anyway.
And what would women want with them?
True.
You know, where would they be going?
Yeah.
You know. So that's just one thing that came back to my mind at the time. Anyway, as I say, more cars and more televisions began to appear. And I remember when we got our first television. Now, you didn't go down to the shop and buy the television. You went to a guy called Tommy Murray, and you rented a television off Tommy.
Rented?
Yeah, you rented it. And Tommy arrived around, it was a great occasion, you know. I mean, you had to find space for the television. It was big. And then, you know, Tommy arrived, and in would come this huge, big television, black and white, and it'd be popped up and everything would be set up, and Tommy had said, now, fair play to Tommy, he did Boyle a great service, because not only could you get RTE on Tommy's television, but he'd set up an aerial somewhere. I'm sure it wasn't legal at the time, or maybe it was legal at the time, and you were able to get BBC. Which really gave us a window into the outside world, you know. Anyway, RTE didn't start till 6 o'clock or something, you know, So we got the BBC, and I always remember the first night the television arrived into the house, and we turned it on, and we went straight to BBC, and the Mike Yarwood show was on.
I never heard of that.
Mike Yarwood was a very famous BBC comedian in the 60s and the 70s, and, you know, he was an impressionist. He could do impersonations of various politicians and public figures. And, of course, he was, you know, this was just fascinating for us, gathered around this television watching Mike Yarwood. I know that my parents, anyway, I don't know, was this common in other homes, but they generally watched the BBC because there was more variety, and most of the programs on RT at the time were imported from America, and my father couldn't stand American programs. He thought they were just rubbish. But anyway, we all watched. And the other thing about it, which was Boyle, as I said, being a soccer town, we could watch Match of the Day on a Saturday night. And that was the highlight of our week. Right. I can still remember the music of Match of the Day, and sitting there and watching these players playing in mud in the winter. And, of course, our hero, Georgie Best. I still have a recollection of him scoring 4 or 5 goals on a muddy pitch, you know, playing for Man United. Yeah. So, you know, Match of the Day was on a Saturday night. It was the highlight of the week, and that was what we waited for. Now, the reason I think that 1968 was the year we got our TV was the Vietnam War was still on. Now, the Vietnam War was, you know, American forces and other forces were involved in supporting the South Vietnamese government in Vietnam against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, which were invading at the time. And I remember that the Vietnam War was kind of the first war that was televised, shall we say, because you used to get on-the-spot reporters, especially at the BBC, not RTE, they couldn't afford to send anybody out to Vietnam, but the BBC could, and you would get BBC reporters kind of reporting from Saigon and, you know, talking about the casualties. And I remember, I think we got our television 1968 was the bloodiest year of the Vietnam War was 1968. Nearly 15,000 US troops were killed that year alone. And I think something like 400 or 500 of them on one day, during the Tet Offensive. And I remember that being kind of almost horrible to contemplate. Now, what you've got to also remember is thousands of Vietnamese civilians had also been killed, much more than the American servicemen. But sitting in Boyle, I don't know, you kind of, because loads of us had relatives in America, you kind of related more to the American deaths than you did to the Vietnamese deaths. Strange thing, but I just remember recalling my mother being very, very upset when she heard about the number of casualties the Americans were sustaining at the time. And I suppose, in retrospect, the United States couldn't take that amount of casualties. Like, I mean, you're talking about almost 15,000 men killed in 1 year, and most of them were draftees. They weren't professional soldiers. They were just drafted and sent out there, But that's why I think 1968 was the year that we got our television. Anyway, I'm trying to think of other little things from my childhood, but...
the World Cup 1970?
Oh, yes, 1970. Right. That was a big year.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that year. The reason being was, okay, we had our television, but the World Cup of 1970 was coming up, and it was being played in Mexico. Mexico seemed so far away, so exotic, just reminded you of all those kind of Mexicans from Westerns like the Magnificent Seven or something, But that was where the World Cup was going to be played. Now, just going back briefly to 1966, which was the year we moved to Boyle, that was the year of the World Cup in Wembley, in which England bet West Germany in the final. Now, I have no recollection of that World Cup. We didn't have a television, wasn't televised. I don't remember being on the radio or whatever. I just have no recollection of that. I do have one other recollection of 1966. The All-Ireland Fleadh was held in Boyle that year.
Correct.
And I do remember, very vague memory of huge crowds on the Crescent and down over the bridge and things like that. But that's just a small digression there from 1970. But 1970, World Cup in Mexico. And 16 teams from around the world, including the holders, England, were all going to converge on Mexico, and it was going to be shown live on TV, live. This was the first time a World Cup was going to be shown live.
In colour as well?
No, it was in colour.
But you had black and white.
But we had black and white TVs.
Yeah. So it was available in colour, or was the technology available in Ireland at that time? Do you know?
I'm not sure, but towards the end of this chat, I'll tell you an interesting fact, which was, but I do know it was in colour because I actually saw it again in colour. But I'll talk about that when we get to that.
Oh, it definitely was in colour for sure.
Oh yeah,
I just wondered,
it was
your TV?
No, our TV was black and white, and all the other TVs were black and white. Now, this might seem strange in the Ireland of 2023, but England was our team. We knew all the English players. We watched them on Match of the Day. They were our neighbours. We all had relatives in England. So England was the team we supported. Now, that might sound very strange to the kind of anything but England attitude that exists in Ireland today, which is you'd support any team as long as that was playing England.
Unless it was in the Premiership, of course.
Yes, of course, yeah. But I just remember, and when I tell this to people, they find it hard to believe. Everybody was supporting England. You said, yeah, of course they were. We were hardly going to support El Salvador. England was, certainly weren't going to support West Germany. The war was only over 25 years. So, England was the team, and we knew all the players. Bobby Moore was the captain. Gordon Banks was the goalie, and you had Bobby Charlton that played for Man United. Great skillful player. And you had his brother Jack, who played for Leeds. Not as well known and not as popular as Bobby, but there nonetheless. There was Jeff Astle that played for West Brom. I can remember those players so clearly, And also, there was another little extra thrown in. An Italian company called Panini had printed World Cup cards.
That's right.
And stickers. So you could collect cards of all the players from all the 16 teams. And then you could buy an album and you could stick them in. And then you could go around the town and you could swap them.
Yeah,
and,
that's right. Yeah.
All these. And of course, certain teams were, more sought after than others.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I filled the Israeli team in no time. But I couldn't, I had one or two for England, there's two characters from Boyle that always stick in my mind at this time. One was the late Donald Brennan, who lived up on the Crescent, and the other was Donny Farrell. And the two of them, they seemed to have a monopoly on these cards. They had all the best cards, and they had doubles of them. Which they swapped for extortionate numbers of the other players from the more minor teams. But anyway, all a bit of fun, and I had my album and sticking them all in. Now, as I say, we all supported England, and we didn't really know too much about the other teams that were playing. There were 16 teams in total. And we didn't really know too much about them. I suppose, even if we were given a world map, we might have had difficulties pointing out some of the teams. As I said, I mentioned West Germany. Now, East Germany was divided at the time, hadn't qualified. So West Germany, which doesn't exist anymore, it's now Germany. And then there was also Czechoslovakia. Now you have two countries. You have the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Back then, it was Czechoslovakia. So anyway, game started. I remember the first game I think it was around the 2nd of June, 1966. So, the first game England played in, shall we say. And they were playing in a place called Guadalajara. It sounded even more exotic.
Yeah.
You were thinking of a bullfight, and I think some of the games were actually more dangerous than bullfights. But anyway, never mind. So England's first game was against Romania, and I remember they bet Romania 1-0. Not a great game, but England were there. They were going to get it. They were our team. We were going to support them. So England bet Romania 1-0. The next game, they were up against Brazil. Now, we kind of knew where Brazil was because it's a very big country. And although we didn't know them at the time, they had some very skillful players. Probably the best national World Cup team ever, 1970. You're talking about Jairzinho. You're talking about Pele, who died recently,
Yeah, that's right.
And these were all exotic names to us. We could hardly pronounce them, But England played Brazil. And the Brazilians they played a different game of football altogether. They were just all over England. England were struggling from the beginning against this team. And a Brazilian player called Jairzinho scored. And Pele had a shot at goal. Fantastic save by Gordon Banks. Probably one of the best saves ever.
That was save of the century from the header, yeah.
Yeah. So England lost that game 1-0. But we were all kind of suddenly changing our allegiance. Brazil were brilliant, Jairzinho, Pele, we were changing, this was a good team, they were much better than England and had proved it by beating England 1-0. Anyway, England went on then for their last game in the group series to play Czechoslovakia. And I remember one little thing from that game is England were playing all in white and Czechoslovakia were playing in light blue. So it was very hard on a black and white television.
Yeah, that's right.
To
distinguish who was who.
Distinguish who was who. Right. And the cameras didn't actually have close-ups in those days, Anyway, England got through that one. They bet Czechoslovakia 1-0 and they were through to the quarterfinals. And they were drawn against West Germany. So you were going to have a kind of a rerun of the World Cup final that had happened 66. 4 years before. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we were all up there for England. They were going to get through. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you supported, it didn't work out as planned. Although England led 2-0 for most of the game, Germany fought back. The England manager, Ramsey, took off Bobby Charlton, his best player. That allowed a German player called Gerd Müller, who was the top scorer in the competition in the end. He scored 10 goals. That allowed him loose. And when he got loose, he levelled the game. It went to extra time and England lost 3-2. And they were out of the competition. Devastation. You know,
Yeah.
They were on their way back to England. So you had to pick another team. They were gone, so you had to pick another team. So anyway, I remember the World Cup final ended up, West Germany got knocked out, but it ended up between Brazil and Italy. And it took place in the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City. And I'm pretty sure it was on a Sunday. Another thing you got to remember about these games was they were all played in Mexico around 12 noon. So that was prime time on European television. So they were every evening, 7 o'clock. You were watching these games. So that World Cup final, Brazil against Italy, I remember my neighbour Mickey Mulrennan and I put a bet on. I don't know whether it was sixpence or a shilling. Might have been sixpence. And he bet on Italy because they'd played quite well in the semi-final. And I bet on Brazil. And not only did I bet on Brazil, but I bet that Jairzinho would score because he had scored in every game that Brazil had played up until then. Anyway, the game started and, to cut a long story short, Brazil bet Italy 4-1 and they became the World Cup champions that year. The game had no sooner ended when the doorbell rang and I went out and there was Mickey with his sixpence or his shilling.
Straight away. Well deserved.
Poor Mickey is no longer with us, but he was a great neighbour and a good friend over the years. So anyway, that was my memories of the World Cup of 1970. Everybody, I suppose, remembers their first World Cup. That was my first World Cup. I remember collecting all the cards. I don't know where they are now. But I looked up on eBay there recently and they're worth a lot of money if you have the full collection.
I'd say so, yeah. They fetch a lot.
Yeah.
They would.
They would fetch a lot these days, so maybe I should have a look up in the attic again. So anyway, that was the World Cup of 1970, which I remember well. And what was great about that World Cup for us living in Marion Road was it actually brought a ray of sunshine from sunny Mexico to Ireland, And, of course, we were all back out playing football straight away once these games are over, and we all wanted now to be Pele and Jairzinho and,
No more Georgie Best.
No more Georgie Best, Georgie hadn't made the World Cup, being a Northern Ireland international. And also the funny thing about it, that was Mexico 70. And when you think of the Republic of Ireland, which is the team that I go and see now, I have a season ticket for the Aviva. They existed, but they didn't figure anywhere in getting through to any of these major competitions. I mean, they really, really didn't figure anywhere. And when you think, it was only 20 years later that Jack Charlton, who played on that England team in Mexico 70, brought the Republic of Ireland through to Italia 90, to Italy in
quarterfinals.
To the quarterfinal, 1990. I mean, just amazing. 20 years, the transformation of football in that time, Irish football in that time, So kind of a happy memory that I have of that time and, those kind of lazy summer evenings of June 1970. And just when you were talking about the World Cup being in colour, the thing about it was, when the World Cup was over, a movie was made. Well, during the World Cup, a movie was made. It was called The World at Their Feet. And basically, it was a movie about the World Cup with a very kind of small plot about a young Mexican boy who makes his way to Mexico City and he goes to see all the games and he meets all the stars. And that was in colour. And that was shown in the Abbey Cinema in Boyle.
On the Crescent, right?
On the Crescent, yeah.
Tony Farrell's
cinema at the time, or his dad's cinema. And that was shown, I think, maybe later on that summer, I think I went to see that twice. You know, I mean, you just couldn't get enough of this stuff.
Of course, yeah.
You know. So that's why I know it was in colour, because that was in colour, and it was just so brilliant to watch, even though you knew what the results were going to be and all that. But a kind of a time I look back on happily, you know, and I really enjoyed that time. And just one little postscript to that before I finish on that subject. In 1993, I happened to be in Mexico. I never thought in 1970 that 23 years later I'd be in Mexico City. But anyway, I found myself in Mexico City, and I made a special visit to the Azteca Stadium, which was where the final between Brazil and Italy took place. And I looked up on the internet recently, and there was a huge number at that game.
Over 105,000 or something.
5,000 attended that game.
Yeah, right, yeah. It was huge.
Massive. And like the stadium is very impressive, very big, and it's kind of not too far from the centre of Mexico City.
They were all standing up as well back then.
Yeah, stand up, yeah. And also, what you got to remember is in 1986, Mexico hosted the World Cup again, and the Azteca Stadium was the famous place of the hand of God by Maradona.
Yeah.
So Mexico was not a happy hunting ground for the English football team in 1970, nor again in 1986.
No.
Anyway, that's my memories of the World Cup. The other memories I have from that time was the different schools I attended, and you know, some people from Boyle might relate to this a little bit, who were around that time and hopefully are still around. The first school I attended in Boyle was the convent, which is still there. I pass it every day when I'm coming from Carrick, and I attended there for about 2 years. Then I went out to my father's school in Carrick Rory for 2 years. That closed down in 1970, so I had to come back to St. Joseph's National School in Boyle. And when I came back to St. Joseph's National School in Boyle, I rejoined 4th class. And at the time, it was where Carty's Garage is now.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Just on the kind of as you go up Chapel Street.
Yeah,
that's where it was.
It was fine, huge big building. And we were there for a little while. Now, that building was sold, and it became a factory. It used to be known locally as a knickers factory, because I think it made underwear. But when that was sold, the new school hadn't been built. So the boys' national school became homeless. And we went from there to the Clues Hall. We were there for about a year. Now, the Clues Hall is where Sweeney's funeral home is now. And then we moved down to the convent, and we were there for about a year. And I just recall my teachers at that time. One was Michael Carty, who later became the headmaster of the school, and the other was Paddy Kennedy. I had Paddy in 6th class. So I finished St. Joseph's National School in June or July of 1972, and then I went up to St. Mary's College in Boyle. But I don't know when I never actually attended what is now St. Joseph's National School. That was still being built at the time, and I don't think it was finished for a few years. So at that time that I was there, Boyle Primary School was homeless. It was moving around the town at many different locations, you know. And my kids always think it's funny because I say, I went to school there, I went to school there, I went to school. They say, how many schools did you go to? Like, you know. They find it hard to think that there was a school in the same school was in a number of different locations, which is quite amusing. I suppose, you know, I'll finish my story there in 1970. You know, your childhood should always be, and in my case at that time was quite a happy one. It's only when you go into your teenage years that the straitjacket of the social scrutiny of a small town begins to constrict you to a certain degree. And I'm not saying I didn't have any happy memories from then, but, they weren't as wild, as carefree as you were when you were, we'd say,
Of course not. No, yeah.
10 and under.
Yeah.
And your parents were young, and they, you thought they were great. And, of course, they thought you were great. But anyway, that's the end of my little podcast, and I hope people enjoy it. And for some people, it'll bring back memories.
Absolutely, it will. Yeah, especially some of them names you mentioned from Marion Road back in those days.
Oh yeah, I just want to mention one other person, a man that When I talked at the beginning of this about the program for economic expansion in Ireland that Lemass set up in the early '60s. One of my neighbours in Marian Road was a gentleman. He's still around. I met him recently, Patsy Quinn.
Ah, yes.
Now, I was very friendly, and I still am friendly, with Patsy's son, Michael. We were the same age, and, we walked to school together and all that kind of thing from Marian Road. But Patsy was a very interesting man. I'm not saying that the other people in Marian Road weren't interesting, but Patsy was kind of unusual in one way. Like my parents, Patsy had left Ireland, and he had actually lived in London for a good many years. And then in the 60s, him and his wife and his children moved back to Ireland. And Patsy was just telling me this recently. And they moved first to Carlow, because I think that's where his wife is from. And then they moved back to Boyle. And Patsy, almost single-handedly, he got a piece of land quite near where I talked about where the St. Joseph's National School was originally, up Chapel Lane, the back of what is now Carty's Garage. And he built himself a factory. It was called the Nair Factory.
The Nair Factory, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Brought great business to the town.
It did. And, I suppose that Patsy was a real example of how Ireland was changing, in that, there were many Patsy Quinns, but they had all gone to England and done well there, or gone to America and done well there. Patsy was one of the people that I said, immigration stopped in the early to mid-60s. Well, it slowed down, didn't stop altogether, but people began to come back to Ireland as well, because for once there was now opportunities for people to actually do things. So Patsy came back to Boyle with his family. He built a factory. He opened it in November 1966, which was the same year that we moved to Boyle, and he provided employment. He provided employment for a lot of people in Boyle for very, very many years. He showed a real entrepreneurial spirit, He
did, yeah.
And I really think, and he was a neighbour of mine. I knew him well, very nice man. And when you think about it, if Patsy hadn't built that factory, how many of those families would have had to immigrate or move somewhere else?
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. A lot of people I talked to said they got their first job was working in Nair Factory.
Working in Nair Factory, and it kept going for a very, very long time, And I mean, that's my tribute to one of my neighbours.
Yeah, that's nice.
And it was lovely to see Patsy there again recently. He's still alive, and
I'd love to get him on to tell his story. I'd love to get him on the podcast. So.
And I'm sure he'd give you plenty of detail. I'm only just giving you a brief outline.
Yeah, no, it's good.
But it's nice to recall, and even nowadays when I go up to Marion Road and it's changed, and the college is now Abbey. What is Abbey
Community? Yeah,
Abbey Community, and even the profile of the pupils of the school has changed so dramatically since I went there. And you walk up and down Marion Road, and you think of your childhood, and you think of the people who lived in the different houses and the different families that grew up there. And, I can only look back on it as a kind of a happy time. And I suppose the other thing is about it's in retrospect of what you remember, the weather always seemed to be quite good.
Even I remember when I was young in the 80s and that the weather was always good.
Yeah.
Which is a stark contrast to what we're looking at now.
Yeah. So. But anyway, that's the end of
That's lovely. So there's Oliver. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. That was a good insight and some fascinating little tidbits there about black and white TVs back in the in Marion Road.
And another entrepreneur, Tommy Murray. We mustn't forget him.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So that's perfect. Thank you very much, Oliver.
Okay, thanks very much, Carlo.
So that's it for this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you like the content, we'd really appreciate it if you could share it. You can follow us on Facebook by searching for Voices of Boyle, and you can also contact us on our website by visiting voicesofboyle.com. We're always looking for new guests, so if you'd like to be on the show, or if you know someone who you'd like to join us, please reach out to us via our Facebook page or website. Thanks very much, and we'll chat to you again soon.